Hello, friends. Hello, enemies. Hello, mother. Hello, father. Although I hope they're not watching. I don't know why I said that. Um. Anyway, so there's still quite a bit going on. I don't know if you've been following any of my recent output, but I've been in Chicago for the past several days, and I've been making a point to go to some of the areas on the south and west side where staggering amounts of rioting and looting took place, and yet it seems like it hasn't gotten the amount of attention proportionate to the scale of what seemingly transpired. Like, you can drive through parts of the south side of Chicago, like Avalon Park, and just see entire stretches of neighborhood that are just totally boarded up and seemingly don't appear like they're going to probably ever reopen. At least certain establishments don't seem like they're ever going to reopen. And I was on the west side yesterday, and you may have seen a video that I uploaded yesterday afternoon with a resident there, and he was agreeing with actually a police officer who had observed to me that, again, it seemed like the extent of the unrest that occurred in these particular areas has gone underreported. And in particular, it's amazing to me that, at least if you listen to what this gentleman said, and it had been kind of corroborated by others, that the police, at least in Chicago, appeared all ready to kind of move in and stop the rioting when it first broke out on that initial weekend. Yet they kind of just stood down. They were either overpowered or they had some kind of political or logistical directive handed down to them, which led to them not really engaging in any significant way to prevent the chaos. And that is just interesting in terms of the history of American policing. I mean, I can't, off the top of my head anyway, think of a antecedent for that in terms of how police generally approach unrest of that sort. Perhaps that was because the scope of the unrest was just so massive that they couldn't deal with it. It was outside of their capacity, beyond their capacity to deal with. And if so, that would be a story in its own right. That's pretty astonishing. And so, just being in Chicago these past couple days and kind of combining that with my observations of places like Philadelphia, of the Bronx, Manhattan, and even places you wouldn't expect like Fort Wayne, Indiana, which I've mentioned on previous videos, I gotta think that it's at least possible, it's at least plausible, that the unrest or the rioting or the looting, however you want to characterize it, that broke out on that first weekend and then stretched into the following week. So this was May 29th, is that right? Yeah, Friday, May 29th, then that weekend into June 1st, and then the next couple days, June 2nd, 3rd, etc. That stretch of time, and we've seen little bit of unrest. We've seen sporadic instances of unrest since then, but that first weekend, that kind of contained sequence of days, may represent the most wide-scale, pervasive, prevalent nationwide rioting ever. Now, it doesn't mean that each individual instance of rioting was necessarily the most severe. So, like the LA riots in, what was it, 92? Yeah, 92, produced more violence, produced more deaths within a contained area. But we're talking now about a nationwide outbreak that was fueled, I think, in large part by social media. So you didn't have social media in 1992 where somebody on the other side of the country could look at what was going on in LA and decide to, tear up wherever, Philadelphia, right? I mean, it's just a different kind of communication landscape now, which sort of enables these sort of meme style riots, right? Like you have one thing happening one place and then it gets posted and people talk about it, and then the idea gets implanted in somebody else who then kind of mobilize their social peer group or whatever, and then they can all take part in the same nationwide event. And in this case, it even became kind of like an international event, which is crazy. I don't know if there was rioting in Europe. I haven't heard of that. But the protest movement, in any event, did migrate amazingly quickly to places where you would never have expected necessarily, such as like Berlin. Why is there a giant Black Lives Matter protest in Berlin? I mean, is that a salient issue in Germany? I mean, maybe I'm not familiar enough with the racial dynamics of Germany to know, but Black Lives Matter relates to Black Americans in the U.S. And so for them to kind of like take that on as a movement that's relevant to their own situation is itself kind of an indicator of how these meme style political events function, right, on a grand scale. But okay, so let's say it's at least plausible that that the riots that broke out in conjunction with the protest or separate from the protest or whatever. I mean, it's a chaotic situation. You can't necessarily draw a causal connection between each little bit and piece, right? But let's say that the rioting component that did occur during that span of time, which I said in late May and early June, was in fact, or at least it's plausible that it was the most prevalent, widespread outbreak of rioting ever. I mean, don't you think we should have a little bit more discussion of that? I mean, doesn't it seem like, yeah, there was a lot of media coverage around the riots and protests, but I don't know, the full meaning of it doesn't seem like it's been internalized yet. It seems like something's missing, and there's a couple possible explanations for this. Number one is that journalists and others in the culture producing industry believe that if they granted attention to that aspect of what happened, it would benefit Trump. And so they're not doing it. That's probably a little bit of an oversimplification. I don't think every single journalist literally in America is consciously thinking to themselves, oh my goodness, we can't cover what happened in Chicago or something because it could help Trump. But I think that's in the ether as some kind of motivating factor. And to me, it's not even obvious that it would help Trump. Like, Trump is demonstrating his political ineptitude day after day because, notwithstanding this really seismic eruption of left-wing hysteria that the country has been engulfed by for several weeks now, he can't really capitalize on it. He can't leverage it into something that solidifies his own political standing. He's the incumbent president. He's got the resources of the federal government behind him. He's got a media apparatus. And yet he seems like he's ambivalent on how to handle a lot of this stuff. He does his typical pundit and chief style routine where he kind of just muses about different sides of things and just doesn't come down on any particular hard position. So it's not even clear to me that giving these events the coverage that they would seemingly warrant necessarily would redound to the advantage of Trump politically. And even if it did, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't be inhibited. You shouldn't inhibit yourself from presenting a truthful account of what happened in the country, even if it was established that it would help Trump, which it's not. And the other explanation is, which I think is probably a little bit more relevant, or it's kind of works in tandem with the Trump explanation, is that journalists and media and corporations and technocrats and academics and so many others are personally invested in what they regard as the movement. Now, when you're talking about the movement, I don't even know what that necessarily even refers to, because it's got many dimensions. It's not like there's a control center, a command center or something where like the dictates of the movement are being expressed and circulated. I mean, so it's not like a homogenized movement really in any respect. But a lot of journalists do feel as though that at least the ostensible underlying reasons for the movement are wholly legitimate. They support them. They support whatever manifestation that takes. And they're just kind of they're parts of the movement. We've had journalists now who've been given authorization to participate themselves in protests as protesters, not covering it, not been given a mandate to give it favorable framing in their reports. No, they've been authorized, even at some of the most mainline, banal outlets like Axios. Look up Axios if you're not familiar with it. It's like the new iteration of Politico. The guy who started Politico literally started Axios. Okay, and because of whatever internal turmoil was existent at Axios, the publisher was forced, or no, maybe not forced, maybe he did do it willingly. The publisher was placed in a position where he was granting license. He was authorizing and supporting the ability of Axios journalists to go and themselves protest. Okay, so that's a giant sea change in how quote unquote mainstream media generally operates. Now, I'm not advocating for objectivity. That's a false doctrine that should have been discarded long ago. And I mentioned this in a previous video. But the point is that you have journalists who are themselves personally invested in the quote-unquote movement. So if they spend any time sort of like ascertaining the scope of the riots, if they put together like a study or a survey or an infographic or anything, it could run the risk in their minds of being twisted and being used to discredit the quote movement. And so that means that I think you're not getting a truthful, accurate rendering in the media of what went on here, which is why I've made a point to myself, at least try to compensate for that in my small capacity. Like, I can't do it all myself, obviously. It's a huge story. It almost seems overwhelming to even know where to begin a lot of the times. But like for example, here's another thing that if you're not consciously paying attention, you probably would have missed. I missed this until, what was it, Saturday? When I just happened to look it up. Or I don't even remember how I came across my transom. But on this kind of critical weekend, right, where the potentially history-making riots took place, you had the most homicides ever in Chicago within a single 24-hour period. So this was May 31st. 18 people killed in Chicago on May 31st, which is, by a lot, the most homicides ever recorded in a single day span in Chicago since records began to be collected 60 plus years ago. It's like, isn't that a big story? I'm not doing one of these typical Breitbart, talk radio things where I'm saying, oh, what about black on black violence? That's a generic dumbed down point. I'm saying if we're talking about these events, this latest event, which we're still trying to get a handle on, isn't a notable element of what happened that Chicago, in the midst of this unrest, saw the most homicides ever in recorded history? I would think so. This is from the University of Chicago Crime Lab, which began collecting this data in 1961, so just under 60 years. And we don't have the data from like the Al Capone era, as somebody just mentioned, so maybe it was worse then. I don't know. I'm telling you, since they started recording data in 1961, Chicago, which is nationally and internationally known as one of the most dangerous places in the U.S., with an epidemic of homicides, recorded the most homicides ever on May 31st. And I just happened to come across this on Saturday because I was just scrolling through Chicago-related stuff because I'm there. But like, that's so like if that wasn't really represented within the broader narrative about what this unrest protest stuff has signified, then how much other stuff has been under discussed or undercovered? I don't know. I mean, that's why I'm, doing my small part here in trying to figure out what the deal is. So On, was it Thursday of last week, I published a column in the New York Daily News, which of course I'll link to, and I'm going to put in the description box as usual, essentially about another underappreciated aspect of the story, which is now that the political legitimacy of coronavirus containment efforts has been obliterated. Okay? And whether you're for those containment efforts or you're against them, the political legitimacy that allowed them to be implemented is now gone. And that's worth, I think, maybe dwelling on a tad, given that we're seeing cases spike in different parts of the country, like Arizona, North Carolina, Florida, California. Okay? So now it's not even within like the policy portfolio of elected officials to instate like a lockdown type situation. That's just gone because they've shown themselves to be essentially phonies when they're running around saying that by dint of my executive order, you may not gather with more than 25 people, blah, 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 blah. And all that went out the window because you had so many elected officials themselves not just sanction, not just grant license to legally, but participate in and advocate for and encourage others to come out to attend these mass gatherings. So clearly the legal strictures that they put in place around mass gatherings were just fictitious. And fictitious in the sense that they were contingent on politics. They could be radically overturned at a moment's notice if a new political cause emerges, which they find to be favorable. And so if those are the people now who are going to be saying, like, let's say in 2 weeks where we get to a horrible situation, I don't know, Arizona, or let's say it comes back to a significant extent in New York or New Jersey or something, how are you then going to be sitting there listening to the mayors, and other elected officials who spent 3 months berating people and lecturing people to stay in? I was one of the people who did mostly stay in. I was on board with these containment measures. And so I'm even offended on a personal level, just as a citizen, that the people now who are in charge of presiding over those enforcement measures just ditched it the minute it became politically expedient. And they don't even reconcile with the inconsistency here. Like, I haven't heard a single elected official, maybe I missed it, if so, send it to me, who has been made to account for why they are encouraging violations, and even themselves in some cases violating, their own executive orders around coronavirus containment measures. So, for example, in Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker still has in place a statewide executive order that prohibits, not just says is not a good idea, but prohibits legally, using his binding authority as governor, mass gatherings of more than 10 people, okay? And there's a similar order on a city level in Chicago. And yet, I was in Chicago on Juneteenth, on Friday, where you had crowds, enormous crowds, gathering. No social distancing in place. Yeah, they do wear masks, sure. But, it's in direct, explicit violation of the legal orders that are in place that everybody else is expected to abide by. In another event on Juneteenth, Pritzker, along with Tammy Duckworth, the senator, they attended a march that was in direct violation of Pritzker's own order. So whether or not you're in favor of the order, you should be interested in this discrepancy. Like, how does it even be, how is it reconciled? Does it have to be explained? Or are we just supposed to move on and pretend like nothing happened? I'm not willing to do that because I can go look up the executive orders that are still technically legally binding in these jurisdictions and tell you that what the politicians themselves are doing is in violation of their own orders. I'm sorry, that has major implications for public policy, for, again, the political legitimacy of potential forthcoming containment measure. So yeah, it's got to be reckoned with, and on some level, and it's just not. And it's another one of these many trends or aspects of this story that erupted ever since the George Floyd killing that just gets swept under the rug, it seems. So again, I'm doing my small part in bringing some attention to it, and most of the violators here, in terms of the discrepancies, tend to be Democrats, not exclusively. And in pointing out their conduct, I'm not excusing the extremely poor response federally and even in states that the U.S. has had overall to the pandemic. I mean, it's just a joke. We're supposed to be this world historic superpower with all the economic and military resources ever, this triumph of human history. And look, I mean, we're something about whether it's because of something inherent to the constitutional order or because of the shortcomings of the elected officials or some cultural issues, whatever. The U.S. is just not in a position to competently curtail a pandemic. And again, that has severe long-term implications just for the nature of the polity and for the status of the U.S. as this hegemonic power. And I think Trump is partially to blame for that. I mean, look at Trump's early comments in the early days of the pandemic were ridiculous, where he was saying that it was essentially a hoax. I know people are going to say, oh, he didn't actually say the virus was a hoax. He didn't literally say the biological virus is itself a hoax, but he was using the terminology of hoaxes in discussing the status of the virus, so it conveyed to his backers, his followers, that it was no problem. Then a lot of them ended up getting the virus and dying. Okay, so that was bad on Trump's part. So I'm not excusing Trump, but Trump is not guilty of some of this outright, just inexplicable, contradictory behavior. At least in terms of this narrow category of behavior that I'm talking about, in terms of these mass gatherings. And now you have, this movement where people are posting on social media that, okay, cases might be spiking, but you better believe that it has nothing to do with these mass gatherings, where people are gathering in hyper close proximity, packed in like sardines, screaming and chanting in one another's face. They're saying, no, that couldn't possibly have spread the virus. The people who are really responsible for perpetrating the virus were the governors, the red state governors, the Republicans in states who opened up too early. Now, is that a factor? I'm sure it is. But if you're saying to me that in Phoenix, it was a perfectly good idea for mass outdoor gatherings where not everybody was wearing masks, most probably were, but not all, screaming at one another's face as the COVID cases spike in the state. If you're saying that was perfectly fine, it couldn't have any effect whatsoever on the circulation of the virus in the area, then you're operating as some kind of voodoo person. I mean, you're talking in a different language, because obviously that could have had an effect, which is why for 3 months everybody was begged not to mass gather. But that went all out the window the moment it became politically expedient. And, I'm not willing to just let that off. Because, as I keep coming back to, it all goes back to the trends. It all comes back to the theme of moral panic. Moral panic that has just dominated U.S. political and cultural life since 2016. This being the latest example, which is why you had this kind of psychic break overnight where everybody just kind of discarded their coronavirus beliefs, and a new belief took precedence. And I titled this video the way I did because you have people running around still saying, oh, the real virus was the pandemic. The real virus was white supremacy, therefore forget about the coronavirus. It's just come on. It's so emotionally manipulative. It's so emotionally manipulative for protesters to be saying that, but I don't even blame the protesters themselves. Who knows if they have all the information? Who knows what their logical thinking is like? But you have a reason why they are propounding that message, meaning, oh, the real virus was actually white supremacy all along, is because you have public health officials, experts, saying the same thing. You had an open letter organized by the University of Washington scientists who effectively said that the real virus is white supremacy. And so, should you be surprised when people put that message on their placards and their posters and wave it around and scream and act as though the virus doesn't affect them? And, no, they're not to blame. The crisis of authority and expertise is to blame for that. The language is manipulative because what they're doing is, I mentioned this in the column, is that they're appropriating the vocabulary of virus containment measures that everybody had been instilled with for 3 months, and then applying it to this radically different category of issues around racial disparities, white supremacy or something, to kind of like emotionally bludgeon you, just accepting their framing. Because if you modified your behavior to an extreme extent as a result of the real biological virus, then they're saying, oh, here's another virus. Then you're being emotionally primed to just kind of give in to whatever their demands are, and it's extremely manipulative and repulsive. And if you want to have a legitimate discussion about white supremacy or racism, fine, but you should have to employ these emotionally manipulative tactics in order to do that, because that suggests that your argument is probably not as well founded as you might want to believe. Okay, people, I'm going to leave it there for now. Read that column. It's in the link. If you appreciate anything I've done on this quasi road trip, always welcome you to give money through your super chats, as Sparky just did. Thank you. He says no reconciliation with the scorched strategy. I don't know what that means exactly. But yeah, as we're undergoing this collective mental breakdown, it's probably a good idea to have people who, if you think I'm rational, or at least I'm more rational than the norm, and I have the ability to write, to report, to produce things, then it's nice if you would, contribute something financially toward that end. I'm not going to berate you over it, but I do put all that information in the description box. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll talk to you all later.